They thought she was just another pretty face walking alone at night. They thought she was helpless. They thought they could take what they wanted and walk away. But what they didn't know was that the woman they cornered in that dark alley had spent 8 years learning 50 different ways to end a life with her bare hands. What they didn't know was that behind her calm exterior lived the heart of a warrior who had survived the most brutal training the military had to offer. What they didn't know was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. This is the true story of Sarah Mitchell, a decorated Navy SEAL who proved that the most dangerous opponents are the ones you never see coming. The rain drummed against the windows of Murphy's bar as Sarah Mitchell sat alone at the corner table, nursing her third beer of the evening. The amber liquid had long gone warm, but she wasn't drinking for taste. She was drinking to forget, though she knew from experience that forgetting never really worked. 3 months. It had been 3 months since she'd been medically discharged from the Navy, 3 months since her world had been turned upside down by a roadside bomb in Afghanistan that had taken 2 of her teammates and left her with a titanium plate in her left leg and nightmares that followed her into every waking moment. 3 months since she'd gone from being Petty Officer First Class Sarah Mitchell, one of the first women to successfully complete SEAL training, to being just another veteran trying to figure out what came next. The bar was typical for this part of town: dim lighting, sticky floors, and the kind of regulars who minded their own business. Sarah had chosen it precisely because nobody knew her here. She didn't want to deal with the questions, the looks of pity, or worse, the disbelief that still followed her wherever she went. Even after years of proving herself, even after earning her trident, there were still people who couldn't accept that a woman could be a Navy SEAL. She glanced at her watch. Past midnight. Time to head home to her studio apartment, and another sleepless night. Sarah finished the last sip of her beer and left a 20 on the table, more than enough to cover her tab, and a decent tip. She learned early in life that taking care of people who worked hard for their money was important, and bartending was honest work. The October air hit her face like a cold slap as she stepped out of the bar. Seattle's weather had been particularly brutal this month, with rain that seemed to never stop, and a chill that cut straight through to the bone. Sarah pulled her leather jacket tighter around her shoulders and began the 6-block walk to her apartment building. She'd made this walk dozens of times over the past few weeks, always taking the same route down Pine Street, past the closed storefronts and the occasional homeless person huddled in doorways. Tonight felt different somehow, though she couldn't put her finger on why. Maybe it was the way the street lights seemed dimmer, or how the usual late-night traffic was practically non-existent. Her training had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling her to stay alert. Sarah walked with purpose, but not urgency, her boots clicking against the wet pavement in a steady rhythm. To anyone watching, she would have looked like just another woman walking home alone, exactly what she wanted. One of the first things they taught her in SEAL training was that the best weapon was the one your enemy never saw coming. Appearing harmless while being anything but had kept her alive in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. As she turned down the alley that served as a shortcut to her building, Sarah heard footsteps behind her. 3 sets, matching her pace but slightly heavier. She'd been aware of them for the past 2 blocks, but had hoped they were just headed in the same direction. Now, as they followed her into the narrow alley between 2 old brick buildings, she knew better. The alley was poorly lit, with only one working streetlight about halfway down. Dumpsters and fire escapes created deep shadows on both sides, and the far end was blocked by a chain-link fence. Sarah had known it was a dead end when she'd started using it as a shortcut, but she'd also known that she could climb that fence in under 3 seconds if she needed to. What she hadn't counted on was being followed. "Hey, beautiful," a voice called out from behind her. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" Sarah kept walking, her pace steady and unchanged. She'd been catcalled before, and sometimes the best strategy was simply to ignore it and keep moving. But the footsteps behind her were getting closer, and her peripheral vision caught movement on both sides of the alley. More than 3 people now. They were trying to surround her. "I'm talking to you." The voice came again, closer this time. "Don't be rude." Sarah stopped walking and turned around slowly, keeping her hands visible and her posture relaxed. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. 5 men, all larger than her, spread out across the width of the alley to block any escape route back the way she'd come. They were in their 20s or early 30s, dressed in jeans and hoodies with the kind of swagger that came from thinking they owned the night. The one in the middle, apparently their leader, had a thin mustache and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He was holding a knife, letting the blade catch what little light was available. To his left stood a shorter man with a shaved head and tattoos covering his neck. On the right was a tall, skinny guy who kept bouncing on his toes like he was anxious to get started. The other two hung back slightly, but their intent was clear. "That's better," the leader said, taking a step forward. "Now we can have a proper conversation. You know what we want, and we know you've got it. This can go easy or hard, but either way, we're all going to have some fun tonight." Sarah's mind raced through her options. The fence behind her would take precious seconds to climb, and they'd be on her before she made it halfway up. Fighting her way back through all 5 of them to reach the street would be possible, but messy. Her best bet was to try to de-escalate the situation, though her gut told her these men weren't interested in talking their way out of anything. "Look," she said, keeping her voice calm and level, "I don't want any trouble. I've got maybe $40 in my wallet and a credit card. You can have it all. Just let me walk away." The men laughed, and Sarah knew with sinking certainty that money wasn't what they were after. The leader took another step forward, close enough now that she could smell the alcohol on his breath and see the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You think this is about money? You think we followed you 6 blocks for $40? He gestured to his friends with the knife. "Boys, I think we've got ourselves a real innocent here. Doesn't even know what she's good for." The man with the neck tattoos spoke up, his voice rough like he'd been smoking for years. "Maybe we should show her. Give her some education about what happens to pretty girls who walk alone at night." Sarah felt the familiar calm descending over her, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times before operations in hostile territory. Her heart rate slowed, her breathing became controlled and deliberate, and every sense sharpened to crystal clarity. She could hear the drip of water from a fire escape 20 feet away, could smell the mixture of garbage and rain and unwashed bodies, could see the exact distance between each of her attackers, and calculate the angles of approach. "Please," she said, taking a small step backward and letting just a hint of fear creep into her voice. "I don't want any trouble. Can't we just talk about this?" It was an act, and a good one. Sarah had learned long ago that letting enemies underestimate you is often the difference between life and death. Right now, she needed these men to see her as a victim, as someone who would be easy to control. The more confident they became, the more likely they were to make mistakes. The leader smiled wider, clearly pleased by what he interpreted as submission. "Now you're starting to get it. But talking time is over, beautiful. Time for action." He looked at his friends and jerked his head towards Sarah. "Grab her, and don't be gentle about it." 2 of them moved forward while the others spread out to cut off any escape routes. Sarah let them get within arm's reach, still playing the scared victim, her hands up in a defensive gesture. She could see the anticipation in their eyes, the way they were already thinking about what would happen next. They had no idea they were walking into a trap. The first man, the tall, skinny one, reached for her arm with his right hand while his partner moved to grab her from the left side. Sarah waited until both of them were committed to their movements, until they were close enough that there would be no time to react. Then she struck. Sarah's right elbow snapped up into the tall man's nose with a wet crunch that echoed off the brick walls. As he stumbled backward, blood streaming down his face, she spun to her left and drove her knee into the second attacker's solar plexus. The impact lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing into a row of garbage cans with a tremendous clatter. The leader and his remaining friends stared in shock for perhaps half a second, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. Half a second was more time than Sarah needed. She moved like water flowing downhill, every motion precise and economical. Her left hand shot out and grabbed the leader's wrist, the one holding the knife, while her right hand struck his throat with just enough force to make breathing difficult but not impossible. As he gasped and choked, she twisted his wrist in a direction nature had never intended it to go. The knife clattered to the pavement. The man with the neck tattoos finally overcame his surprise and lunged at her from behind, wrapping his arms around her waist in a bear hug. It might have worked against a normal woman, but Sarah had been training to escape from holds like this since she was 18 years old. She drove her head backward into his nose, then grabbed his right thumb and bent it back until she heard the satisfying pop of dislocation. He screamed and released her, stumbling backward while cradling his hand. Sarah spun around and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the wet pavement. Before he could recover, she was standing over him with her boot pressed against his throat, applying just enough pressure to get his attention. The whole encounter had taken less than 15 seconds. 3 men were down. One was still gasping for air and clutching his throat, and the 5th had apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor and was running back toward the street as fast as his legs could carry him. Sarah looked down at the man under her boot, then at the leader who was slowly recovering his ability to breathe, then at the other 2 who were groaning and trying to assess their injuries. None of them seemed eager to continue the fight. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of leading men in combat. "You're going to get up, you're going to help your friends get up, and you're all going to walk away. Right now. Tonight never happened, and we never saw each other." The leader, still rubbing his throat, managed to croak out, "Who the hell are you?" Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Someone you really didn't want to meet in a dark alley." She paused and let that sink in. "Now move, before I decide you're more trouble than you're worth." They moved. Slowly, painfully, but they moved. The tall man with the broken nose leaned heavily on one of his friends as they stumbled toward the street. The one with the dislocated thumb kept whimpering and shooting fearful glances back at Sarah as they retreated. The leader picked up his knife, but didn't even look at it, just shoved it in his pocket and followed his friends. As they disappeared around the corner, Sarah allowed herself to relax slightly. Her leg was aching where the titanium plate met bone, a reminder that she wasn't quite the soldier she used to be. But she was still more than capable of handling 5 street thugs who thought a woman walking alone was easy prey. She picked up her purse, which had fallen during the fight, and continued walking toward her apartment. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a familiar mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. She'd won, just like she always won, but victory felt different when you were fighting for nothing more than the right to walk home safely. As she climbed the stairs to her studio apartment, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed. 6 months ago, she'd been leading covert operations against some of the most dangerous terrorists in the world. Tonight, she'd been fighting off muggers in a Seattle alley. It wasn't exactly the kind of action she trained for, but violence was violence, and she was still very, very good at it. Sarah unlocked her door and stepped inside, flipping on the lights to reveal a space that was Spartan even by military standards. A bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a kitchenette that she rarely used. The only decoration was a single framed photograph on a nightstand. Her SEAL team, taken just weeks before the bombing that had changed everything. She looked at the faces of her fallen teammates and felt the familiar weight of survivors' guilt settling on her shoulders. Marcus had been 23, fresh out of training and eager to prove himself. Tommy had been a veteran with 2 kids and a wife who was pregnant with their 3rd. Both of them had died doing their jobs, protecting their country and their brothers in arms. And here she was using those same skills to fight off petty criminals in back alleys. It felt like a waste, like she was squandering everything they died for. But what else was she supposed to do? The Navy had made it clear that her fighting days were over, that the injury to her leg made her unfit for active duty. They'd offered her a desk job, but Sarah couldn't imagine spending the rest of her career pushing papers and attending meetings. So here she was, a warrior without a war, a soldier without a mission, living day to day and try to figure out what came next. The encounter in the alley had reminded her that she was still capable, still dangerous when she needed to be. But it had also highlighted just how far she'd fallen from the person she used to be. Sarah sat down on the edge of her bed and began unlacing her boots, a nightly ritual that had remained unchanged since her earliest days in the military. Order and routine had always been her anchors, the things that kept her grounded when everything else was chaos. Even here, in this sterile apartment that felt more like a prison than a home, she maintained the disciplines that had shaped her life. As she prepared for another sleepless night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted tonight. The encounter in the alley hadn't just been a random mugging. It had been a reminder that no matter how far she'd fallen, no matter how lost she felt, she was still a Navy SEAL. She was still someone who could stand between the wolves and the sheep, someone who could make a difference. She just had to figure out how. The rain continued to drum against her window as Sarah laid down on her narrow bed, still fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions about her future that she wasn't ready to answer. But tonight, she'd proven to herself and to 5 would-be attackers that reports of her demise as a warrior had been greatly exaggerated. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes a start was all you needed to find your way back to who you were supposed to be. Outside, the city slept on, unaware that one of its most dangerous protectors was lying awake in a tiny apartment, planning what came next. The morning after the alley incident, Sarah woke before dawn as she had every day for the past 15 years. Her internal clock had been permanently set to military time during her first week of basic training, and civilian life hadn't managed to reset it. She lay in bed for exactly 5 minutes, allowing herself that small luxury before the day began, then rose and began her morning routine. 50 push-ups, 50 sit-ups, 25 pull-ups using the bar she'd installed in her doorway. The exercises were harder now than they'd been before her injury, and she couldn't push herself quite as far, but she refused to let her body deteriorate. A SEAL without physical conditioning was like a pilot without wings. Technically possible, but missing the essential element that made them who they were. As she moved through her workout, Sarah's mind kept returning to the events in the alley. She'd handled the situation professionally, efficiently, with minimal force necessary to neutralize the threat. But something about the whole encounter bothered her, something beyond the obvious fact that 5 men had tried to assault her. It was the way they'd approached it, the confidence they'd shown, the sense that this wasn't their first time hunting in that particular alley. Sarah finished her workout and headed for the shower, letting the hot water wash away the sweat and some of the tension that had been building in her shoulders. As she dressed in jeans and a simple black t-shirt, she made a decision. She was going back to that alley, not because she was looking for trouble, but because trouble had a way of finding people who couldn't defend themselves. The morning news was full of the usual urban problems, budget shortfalls, traffic delays, and crime statistics that seemed to climb every month. Sarah listened with half an ear as she made coffee in her small kitchen, but one story caught her attention. A young woman named Jennifer Parks had been found badly beaten in an alley just 3 blocks from where Sarah lived. She was in the hospital, in stable condition, but unwilling to talk to police about what had happened. The description of the attack site made Sarah's blood run cold. Pine Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. The same route she'd been walking last night, just a few blocks earlier in her journey. The same kind of isolated area where predators could work without interruption. The reporter mentioned that this was the 3rd similar attack in the neighborhood in the past 6 weeks. Sarah turned off the television and sat in the silence of her apartment, thinking, 3 attacks in 6 weeks, all in the same general area, all involving young women walking alone at night. The police had increased patrols, according to the news report, but that obviously wasn't solving the problem. Increased patrols meant the attackers would just wait for the gaps between police presence or move their hunting ground to the next neighborhood over. She knew she should stay out of it. She was a civilian now, with no authority and no backup. Getting involved in what was clearly an ongoing criminal enterprise would be stupid and dangerous, exactly the kind of thing that her former commanding officer would have called her into his office for. But Sarah had never been particularly good at staying out of trouble when innocent people were being hurt. By 10 o'clock, she was walking back toward Murphy's bar, taking the same route she'd used the night before. In daylight, the neighborhood looked different, still rough around the edges, but populated with people going about their normal lives. Store owners sweeping their sidewalks, mothers pushing strollers, workers heading to jobs that paid just enough to keep them above the poverty line. The alley where she'd been attacked looked smaller in daylight, less threatening, but also more sordid. Broken glass sparkled in the corners where it caught the morning sun, and the smell of garbage and urine was stronger without the rain to wash it clean. Sarah walked the length of it slowly, looking for signs of the previous night's encounter. She found them about halfway down. Scuff marks in the dirt where one of the attackers had fallen, a small splash of blood on the brick wall where the tall man's broken nose had painted the surface. Most telling of all, she found the leader's knife, apparently dropped again during their retreat and forgotten in their haste to escape. Sarah picked up the knife carefully, wrapping it in a tissue from her pocket. It was a cheap folding blade, the kind sold at gas stations and pawn shops, but the handle was worn smooth from frequent use. This wasn't a tool someone carried for protection. It was the weapon of someone who used it regularly. As she examined the knife, Sarah heard footsteps approaching from the street into the alley. She palmed the weapon and turned to see a uniformed police officer walking toward her, his hand resting casually on his radio, but not on his gun. He was young, probably early 30s, with the kind of alert posture that suggested he took his job seriously. "Morning, ma'am," the officer said as he approached. "I'm Officer Martinez. Are you okay? This isn't really a safe place to be hanging around." Sarah smiled, keeping her expression friendly and open. "Just taking a shortcut to the bus stop. I work downtown." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had been looking for work downtown, even if her efforts had been largely unsuccessful. Officer Martinez nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. "Have you noticed anything unusual around here lately? We've had some incidents in the neighborhood, and we're asking residents to keep an eye out for suspicious activity." "What kind of incidents?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Assaults, robberies, that sort of thing. Groups of men targeting women who are alone." Martinez paused and studied her face. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't think so. I'm pretty new to the area." She gestured toward the street. "I should probably get going. Don't want to be late for work." Martinez stepped aside to let her pass, but she could feel his eyes on her as she walked toward the street. He was a good cop, she could tell, observant, cautious, but not paranoid, the kind of officer who actually cared about the community he served. Under different circumstances, she might have told him about the previous night's encounter, but she had no intention of spending hours in a police station filling out paperwork and answering questions about her military background. As she walked back toward her apartment, Sarah's mind was already working through the problem. 5 men, working together, hunting in a specific area with obvious knowledge of police patrol schedules. They weren't random criminals. This was an organized operation, probably with the established territory and a regular hunting pattern. The kind of predators who would keep attacking until someone made them stop. The police were trying, but they were reactive rather than proactive. They'd increase patrols after an attack, maybe catch 1 or 2 of the perpetrators if they were lucky, but the core group would just lie low until the heat died down and then resume operations. It was a game of cat and mouse that law enforcement rarely won, especially when they were understaffed and dealing with limited resources. Sarah spent the afternoon researching. She visited the library and used their internet connection to pull up police reports, newspaper articles, and neighborhood forum posts about recent crime in the area. What she found confirmed her suspicions. The attacks had started about 2 months ago, always targeting women between the ages of 20 and 40, always in isolated areas between midnight and 3 in the morning. The police had released composite sketches based on descriptions from the 2 victims who had been willing to talk, but the drawings were vague and contradictory. One victim described the leader as having a mustache. Another said he was clean-shaven. One said he was tall. Another said he was medium height. The sketches looked like they could have been any one of 1,000 men in the city. But Sarah had seen them up close, in good enough light to remember details that victims often missed in their trauma and fear. She could describe the leader's thin mustache and the scar above his left eyebrow. She could identify the neck tattoos on the second man, the nervous tics of the third. Most importantly, she'd seen how they worked together, their tactics, and their hierarchy. The question was what to do with that information. She could call the police and provide descriptions, but that would lead to questions about how she'd obtained such detailed observations. She could try to track down the men herself, but that would mean putting herself in danger with no backup and no legal authority to do anything even if she found them. As evening approached, Sarah found herself standing at her apartment window, looking down at the street where people were beginning their nightly routines. Workers heading home from late shifts, couples going out for dinner, students walking to study groups or parties. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that predators were hunting in their neighborhood. Among the pedestrians, she spotted someone who made her blood run cold. The man with the neck tattoos from the previous night was standing across the street from her building, partially hidden in the shadow of a construction awning. He wasn't looking up at her window, but he was clearly watching the building, occasionally checking his phone like he was waiting for something or someone. Sarah stepped back from the window, her mind racing. How had he found her? She'd been careful not to leave any trail, and she was certain none of them had followed her home. Unless they'd been watching her before last night's encounter. Unless she hadn't been a random victim, but a specific target. She moved to her kitchen and pulled out the burner phone she'd bought during her first week as a civilian. It was a habit from her military days. Always have a backup communication method that couldn't be easily traced or monitored. Sarah scrolled through the contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Jake Morrison, her former team medic, and one of the few people from her old life who stayed in touch. Jake answered on the second ring. Sarah, everything okay? I need you to do me a favor, Sarah said without preamble. Run a background check on someone. Unofficial, off the books. There was a pause. Jake had left the military 6 months before Sarah's injury, and now worked for a private security company that specialized in corporate investigations. He had access to databases and resources that she couldn't reach as a civilian. What kind of trouble are you in? Jake asked. The kind where I need to know who I'm dealing with before it gets worse. Sarah gave him what details she could, physical descriptions, approximate ages, the location where she'd encountered him. Focus on the one with the neck tattoos. Prison Inc., probably local gang affiliation. Sarah, if you're mixed up with gang members, you need to call the police. You're not active duty anymore. You don't have to handle this alone. I'm not mixed up with them, Sarah said. They're mixed up with me. And the police can't handle this the way it needs to be handled. Jake sighed, a sound that conveyed years of friendship and mutual respect. Give me 12 hours. I'll see what I can find. After ending the call, Sarah returned to the window. The man was still there, still watching. She counted at least 3 others positioned at various points around the block, trying to look casual, but clearly coordinating their surveillance. They were better organized than she'd given them credit for, and they were taking her seriously as a threat. Good. That meant they were smart enough to be dangerous, but it also meant they were scared. Scared people made mistakes, and Sarah had built a career on exploiting her enemies' mistakes. As night fell, Sarah began her preparations. She changed into dark clothing, black jeans, black sneakers, a dark gray hoodie that would help her blend in the shadows. She strapped a knife to her ankle and another to her forearm, both military-issue blades that had served her well in Afghanistan. The guns were locked in a safe deposit box across town, too risky to keep in her apartment, but she'd learned long ago that the best weapons were the ones you always had with you. At 11 o'clock, Sarah made her move. Instead of leaving through the front entrance where her watchers were positioned, she climbed out her bathroom window onto the fire escape. The building was old enough that the fire escape system extended all the way to the basement, and from there she could access an alley that ran behind the building. She emerged 3 blocks from her apartment and began a careful reconnaissance of her own neighborhood. If these men were hunting tonight, she was going to be ready for them. But this time, she wouldn't be the victim walking into their trap. This time, she would be the hunter. Sarah moved through the shadows like a ghost, using skills learned in some of the most dangerous places on Earth to navigate the urban terrain of her own city. She knew these streets now, knew where the light failed and the darkness gathered, knew which alleys offered concealment and which were killing zones. At midnight, she found them. They were set up in the same alley where they'd tried to attack her the night before, but this time they were prepared. 2 men positioned at the street entrance to watch for police patrols, 2 more halfway down the alley in positions that would allow them to cut off escape routes, and the leader standing near the dead end, where any victim would be trapped. Sarah watched from a rooftop across the street, using a small pair of binoculars to study their positioning and tactics. They were learning, adapting their approach based on the previous night's failure. The leader had traded his knife for what looked like a telescoping baton, a more effective weapon for controlling a victim without risking a fatal injury that would bring too much police attention. As she watched, a young woman turned into the alley. Sarah's heart stopped. The woman was blonde, probably in her mid-20s, walking with the slightly unsteady gait of someone who'd had a few drinks but wasn't severely impaired. She was wearing a short skirt and heels, the kind of outfit that predators interpreted as vulnerability. Sarah was moving before she'd consciously made the decision to act. She rappelled down the side of the building using a fire escape and a length of paracord she always carried, landing silently in the alley behind the building. From there, she sprinted toward the street, racing against time and her own limitations. The woman had made it about halfway down the alley when the trap was sprung. The two men at the entrance moved to block her retreat while the others closed in from ahead. Sarah could hear the woman's frightened voice echoing off the brick walls as she realized what was happening. Sarah hit the first sentry at full speed, driving her shoulder into his lower back and sending him sprawling into a pile of garbage bags. Before his partner could react, she grabbed him by the throat and drove him face first into the brick wall hard enough to ensure he wouldn't be getting up anytime soon. The commotion had alerted the others, and Sarah could see them rushing toward the street entrance. But now she had the advantage of position and surprise, and she intended to use both. The next man around the corner met her fist traveling at full speed toward his solar plexus. As he doubled over, gasping for breath, Sarah grabbed the back of his head and brought her knee up to meet his face. The impact echoed through the alley like a gunshot. That left two men and one terrified woman who was pressed against the alley wall, shaking with fear and confusion. Sarah could see the leader and one other man advancing toward her, both armed now and clearly no longer interested in taking prisoners. "Lady, you have seriously messed with the wrong people," the leader called out, his voice echoing off the walls. "Last night was just a warm-up. Tonight, we're going to finish what we started." Sarah smiled in the darkness, an expression that held no warmth or mercy. "Tonight," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced down terrorists and warlords, "you're going to learn why they gave me this job in the first place." The education was about to begin, and Sarah intended to make sure it was one they'd never forget. Behind her, she could hear the young woman sobbing softly, but she was alive and unharmed. That was what mattered. Everything else was just details, and Sarah had always been very good with details. The leader raised his baton and took a step forward, his companion moving to flank her from the left. They still thought they had the advantage of numbers and position. They still thought they were the predators. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The leader's baton whistled through the air where Sarah's head had been a fraction of a second earlier. She dropped to one knee and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the pavement with a satisfying thud. Before his companion could react to her change in position, Sarah was already moving, her training taking over as muscle memory kicked in. The second man had pulled a knife, a longer blade than the cheap folder from the night before. He held it low and moved with the confidence of someone who'd used it before. Sarah respected that an armed opponent who knew what he was doing was always more dangerous than a dozen amateurs. She circled to her right, away from his weapon hand, keeping her movements fluid and unpredictable. Behind her, she could hear the young woman's sobbing becoming more panicked, but Sarah couldn't afford to be distracted. One mistake now, and they'd both be victims. The man lunged forward with his knife, aiming for her midsection in a classic prison-style attack. Sarah twisted away from the blade and grabbed his wrist with both hands, using his own momentum to continue his forward motion while redirecting it into the brick wall. His hand hit the stone with a sickening crunch, and the knife clattered away into the shadows. The leader was getting back to his feet, blood streaming from his nose where it had connected with the pavement. He'd lost his baton in the fall, but Sarah could see him reaching for something else in his jacket pocket. In the dim light, she caught the glint of metal. Another weapon, probably a gun this time. Sarah moved faster than conscious thought. She grabbed the man with the crushed hand and spun him around, using his body as a shield while she closed the distance to the leader. The tactic worked perfectly. The leader hesitated for a crucial second, unwilling to shoot through his own man, and that second was all Sarah needed. She shoved the injured man aside and drove her elbow into the leader's throat before he could bring his weapon to bear. As he staggered backward, gasping for air, Sarah grabbed his gun hand and twisted sharply. The weapon, a small revolver, she noted automatically, dropped to the ground. "Enough," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had once directed combat operations across 3 continents. "On your knees. Hands behind your heads. Now." The 2 conscious attackers complied, their earlier bravado completely gone. The leader was still clutching his throat, making wet, gasping sounds as he struggled to breathe. The man with the crushed hand was cradling his injury against his chest, tears of pain streaming down his face. Sarah quickly checked on the other 3 men she'd neutralized. 2 were unconscious but breathing normally. The third was awake but dazed, blood trickling from his scalp where it had met the brick wall. None of them appeared to have life-threatening injuries, which was exactly what she'd intended. "Miss," Sarah called to the young woman, keeping her voice gentle despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "Are you hurt?" The woman shook her head, still pressed against the wall, but no longer sobbing. I don't understand what happened." "Who are you?" "Someone who was in the right place at the right time," Sarah replied. "I need you to call 911. Tell them you were attacked and that the attackers have been subdued. Can you do that for me?" The woman nodded and fumbled for her phone with shaking hands. As she dialed, Sarah began searching the 5 men for additional weapons. She found 2 more knives, a set of brass knuckles, and a small bag of what looked like Rohypnol date rape drugs. The implications made her stomach turn. While she worked, Sarah's mind was already moving to the next phase of the problem. The police would arrive within minutes, and she'd have to explain what had happened without revealing too much about her background or capabilities. More importantly, she'd have to figure out how to ensure these men didn't simply get released on bail and resume their activities in a different part of the city. The leader had recovered enough of his voice to speak, though his words came out as a hoarse whisper. "You think this is over? You think stopping us tonight changes anything?" Sarah knelt down, so she was at eye level with him, close enough that he could see the absolute lack of fear in her expression. "What I think," she said quietly, "is that you're going to tell me who you're working for, where you've been keeping your victims, and how long you've been operating in this neighborhood." The man laughed, a sound like broken glass. "Go to hell, lady. I'm not telling you anything." Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "We'll see about that." She stood up as the first police sirens became audible in the distance. The young woman had finished her call and was standing nearby, still shaken, but no longer paralyzed with fear. She was looking at Sarah with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "What do I tell them about you?" the woman asked. "About what you did?" "Tell them the truth," Sarah replied. "You were attacked, someone intervened, and the attackers are all here waiting for arrest." She paused and looked directly into the woman's eyes. "But you might want to mention that whoever helped you left before the police arrived. Some people prefer to avoid the paperwork." The woman nodded slowly, understanding the subtext. As the police sirens grew closer, Sarah began moving toward the far end of the alley. She'd done what she could hear, but her night was far from over. The leader's defiant attitude suggested this group was part of something larger, and Sarah intended to find out what that something was. She paused at the mouth of the alley and looked back at the scene. 5 men who'd thought themselves predators were now lying on the pavement, waiting to be arrested. One young woman was safe and unharmed. It wasn't a complete victory. There were still questions to be answered and other predators to be stopped, but it was a start. As Sarah disappeared into the shadows, she could hear the police cars pulling up to the scene. Officer Martinez would probably be among the responding units, and he'd undoubtedly noticed the similarities between this incident and whatever had happened in the alley the night before. He was a good cop, and good cops had a way of putting pieces together. But that was a problem for later. Right now, Sarah had other priorities. She made her way back to her apartment through a circuitous route, using every counter-surveillance technique she'd learned over 8 years of special operations. It took her nearly an hour to cover what should have been a 10-minute walk, but she was reasonably certain she hadn't been followed. Back in her studio, Sarah cleaned the minor cuts and bruises she'd sustained in the fight, then sat down at her small table with a notebook and began writing down everything she'd observed. Physical descriptions, tactics, equipment, the casual way the leader had dismissed her threats. It all painted a picture of an organization that was more sophisticated than a simple gang of street criminals. At 3 a.m, her burner phone rang. Jake's number appeared on the screen, which meant he'd found something worth sharing at an hour when normal people were asleep. "Tell me you're not planning anything stupid," Jake said without preamble. "Define stupid," Sarah replied. "Sarah, I'm serious. The guy with the neck tattoos you asked me to check, his name is Vincent Kozlov, and he's connected to some very bad people. Russian mob, human trafficking, the kind of criminals who make drug dealers look like Sunday school teachers." Sarah felt her blood chill. Human trafficking explained a lot: the organized nature of the attacks, the drugs, the careful selection of victims. These men weren't just committing random assaults. They were harvesting women for a much darker purpose. "What else did you find?" she asked. "Kozlov has been arrested 3 times in the past 5 years, always on assault charges, always gets out on bail, and disappears before trial. His known associates include 2 other men who match the descriptions you gave me, Marcus Webb and David Chun. All 3 have connections to a man named Dmitry Volkov, who runs what the FBI thinks is a major trafficking operation out of the Pacific Northwest. Thinks? They've never been able to make anything stick. Volkov is smart, insulated by multiple layers of subordinates, and has enough legitimate business interests to muddy the waters. The women who disappear are usually runaways, addicts, immigrants without family connections, people who won't be missed or whose disappearances won't generate much law enforcement attention." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to process the implications. If Jake was right, the 5 men she encountered weren't just rapists and muggers. They were recruitment agents for a trafficking operation, snatching women off the streets and feeding them into a network that would destroy their lives completely. "Sarah, are you there?" "Yeah, I'm here. Send me everything you found. Addresses, known hangouts, whatever you can put together." "Sada, no. This isn't Afghanistan, and you're not leading a team of SEALs against terrorist cells. This is organized crime in an American city, with lawyers and connections and resources you can't match. Let the FBI handle it. The FBI has been trying to handle it for years, and women are still disappearing," Sarah replied. "Besides, I'm not planning to take on the entire organization. I just want to ask Vincent Kozlov a few questions about tonight's activities." Jake sighed, the sound of a man who knew his friend well enough to recognize when argument was useless. "If you're determined to do this, at least do it smart. Kozlov lives in an apartment building in Capitol Hill, but he's got backup close by. His girlfriend works at a strip club called Paradise Lost, and he usually picks her up after her shift ends at 2 a.m. That's useful information. Sarah, promise me you'll be careful. These aren't insurgents with AK-47s and no training. These are professional criminals who've been operating successfully for years. They know how to make people disappear." "So do I," Sarah said quietly. "But I don't plan on disappearing. I plan on having a conversation with Mr. Kozlov about career alternatives." After ending the call, Sarah spent the rest of the night planning. She'd learned long ago that the key to any successful operation was intelligence, preparation, and patience. Rushing into a situation without proper planning was a good way to get yourself killed, especially when dealing with professional criminals. By morning, she had a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it involved considerable risk, but it would get her the information she needed while minimizing the chances of starting a war with the Russian mob. At least, that was the theory. Sarah spent the day conducting reconnaissance. Paradise Lost was located in a part of the city where legitimate businesses mixed uneasily with less legal enterprises. The strip club occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse, with what appeared to be offices or apartments on the upper floors. Multiple exit routes, limited police presence, and the kind of neighborhood where gunshots might not even generate 911 calls. She observed the evening shift change, noting the security arrangements and the types of customers coming and going. Vincent Kozlov arrived at 11:30, driving a black BMW that probably cost more than most people made in a year. He was accompanied by another man who stayed in the car, while Kozlov went inside. Sarah positioned herself in a coffee shop across the street with a clear view of both the front entrance and the parking area where Kozlov had left his car. She nursed a single cup of coffee for over 2 hours, reading a paperback novel and looking for all the world like someone killing time while waiting for a friend. At 10 minutes to 2, Kozlov emerged from the club with a young woman who was probably in her early 20s. Blonde, petite, wearing the kind of clothes that suggested she'd just finished a shift that involved taking them off. Sarah studied the woman's face and posture, looking for signs of coercion or distress, but saw only the tired satisfaction of someone finishing a night's work. Kozlov's companion got out of the BMW and opened the back door for the woman, a gesture that seemed almost courtly until Sarah noticed the way he positioned himself to block any potential escape route. Professional habits, the kind of small details that separated successful criminals from dead ones. Sarah paid for her coffee and left the shop, timing her exit to coincide with a BMW pulling away from the curb. She had a pretty good idea where they were headed, and she intended to be there waiting for them. Kozlov's apartment building was exactly what she'd expected, expensive enough to suggest success, isolated enough to ensure privacy, and old enough to have the kind of construction that would muffle sounds. Sarah had spent the afternoon studying the building's layout and security systems, and she found exactly what she was looking for. The building's parking garage was accessed through an automated gate that required either a key card or a code. But the pedestrian entrance was protected by nothing more than a standard deadbolt lock, the kind that could be defeated by someone with the right tools and the right training. Sarah was inside the building and positioned in the stairwell by the time Kozlov's BMW entered the garage. She could hear voices echoing up from the lower level, Kozlov and his companion talking in low tones about something that was apparently quite amusing. The woman's voice was absent from the conversation, which struck Sarah as significant. Footsteps on the stairs, moving toward the upper floors. Sarah pressed herself against the wall of the sixth-floor landing and listened as they passed her position. 2 sets of male footsteps, one set of heels clicking on the concrete steps. They stopped at the 8th floor, and she heard the sound of keys and a door opening. Sarah waited exactly 10 minutes, then began her own climb to the 8th floor. It was time for her conversation with Vincent Kozlov, and she had a feeling it was going to be very educational for both of them. Sarah stood outside Kozlov's apartment door for 30 seconds, listening to the sounds from within. A television was playing something with a lot of gunfire and dramatic music, an action movie, probably, turned up loud enough to mask other sounds. She could hear at least 2 male voices having a conversation in what sounded like Russian, and underneath it all, something that made her jaw tighten with anger. Sobbing. A woman crying quietly, but persistently, the kind of sound someone made when they were trying not to be heard but couldn't quite control their distress. Sarah had planned to wait until Kozlov was alone, to catch him when he was relaxed and vulnerable. But the sound of that woman crying changed everything. Some situations couldn't wait for perfect timing. She tested the door handle carefully. Locked, as expected, but the lock was nothing special, a standard residential deadbolt that would take her about 15 seconds to defeat. Sarah pulled out her lockpicks, tools she'd carried since her earliest days in special operations, and went to work. The lock opened with a soft click that was completely masked by the movie soundtrack. Sarah eased the door open just enough to peer inside. The apartment was larger than hers, but decorated with the kind of expensive bad taste that screamed new money. Leather furniture that looked uncomfortable, artwork that was probably expensive but definitely ugly, and enough electronics to stock a small store. Kozlov and his companion were sitting on the couch with their backs to the door, passing a bottle of vodka back and forth while they watched the movie. The woman from the strip club was nowhere to be seen, but Sarah could hear her crying coming from what was probably the bedroom. Sarah slipped inside and closed the door behind her, moving with the absolute silence that had kept her alive in hostile territory. The men were drunk enough and distracted enough that she was able to cross half the living room before either of them noticed her presence. Kozlov's companion saw her first. He started to turn around, probably to make some comment about thinking he'd heard something, and found himself looking directly at Sarah from a distance of about 6 feet. His eyes widened, and his mouth opened to shout a warning, but Sarah was already moving. She vaulted over the back of the couch and landed with her knee driving into the base of his skull. He crumpled forward onto the coffee table, unconscious before he understood what had happened. The bottle of vodka shattered on the floor, filling the air with the smell of alcohol and broken glass. Kozlov tried to stand up, but his reflexes were slowed by drink and shock. Sarah grabbed him by the throat and shoved him back down onto the couch, applying just enough pressure to get his attention without cutting off his air supply entirely. "Vincent Kozlov," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the movie's soundtrack. "We need to have a conversation." Kozlov's eyes were wide with fear and confusion, but Sarah could see him trying to process the situation. He was drunk, but not stupid, and he was clearly trying to figure out who she was and what she wanted. "I don't know who you are, lady, but you just made the biggest mistake of your life," he said, his voice slightly slurred but still defiant. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Actually, I know exactly who I'm messing with. Vincent Kozlov, arrested 3 times for assault, known associate of Marcus Webb and David Chun, all of you working for Dmitry Volkov's trafficking operation. Did I miss anything important?" The defiance in Kozlov's eyes was replaced by something much more interesting: genuine fear. Not just fear of physical harm, but the deeper fear of someone whose carefully constructed world was suddenly falling apart. "I want you to listen very carefully," Sarah continued, her grip on his throat tightening slightly. "In about 5 minutes, I'm going to let you go. You're going to walk out of here, and you're going to call your friends Webb and Chun. You're going to tell them that their hunting days in my neighborhood are over. You're going to find new territory, new victims, new ways to make your living that don't involve women walking home alone at night. And if I don't," Kozlov managed to ask. Sarah's smile widened. "Then I'm going to systematically destroy everyone and everything you care about. Your operation, your associates, your boss, your girlfriend in the bedroom who's crying because of whatever you did to her tonight. I'm going to take apart your entire world piece by piece until there's nothing left but memories." From the bedroom, the crying had stopped. Sarah could hear movement, cautious footsteps approaching the living room. The girlfriend was probably trying to figure out what all the noise was about. "Here's what's going to happen right now," Sarah said, releasing Kozlov's throat but remaining close enough to grab him again if necessary. "You're going to tell your girlfriend that she's free to leave whenever she wants. You're going to give her money for a taxi, and you're going to make it clear that she owes you nothing and you expect nothing from her. Then you're going to sit here and think very seriously about the career advice I've just given you." A young woman appeared in the bedroom doorway, the blonde from the strip club, but now Sarah could see the bruises on her arms and the split lip that makeup had been hiding. The woman looked terrified, confused by the scene in the living room, but clearly afraid to speak or move. Sarah turned to her, keeping her voice gentle but clear. "What's your name, honey?" "Jessica," the woman whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "Jessica, my name is Sarah. I want you to go back to the bedroom and get your things. All of them. Mr. Kozlov is going to give you money for a cab, and you're going to leave here and never come back. Do you understand?" Jessica nodded, still confused but apparently recognizing an opportunity when she saw one. She disappeared back into the bedroom, and Sarah could hear her moving around, gathering belongings. Kozlov started to stand up, but Sarah pushed him back down onto the couch. "We're not finished yet. I want to know about the other women. How many have you taken? Where are they being held? How does the operation work?" "I'm not telling you anything," Kozlov said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You think you can intimidate me? You think this changes anything?" Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out one of her knives, a 7-inch blade that had seen service in 3 different countries. She didn't threaten him with it, didn't even hold it in a particularly aggressive manner, but the implications were clear. Vincent, you're misunderstanding the situation. This isn't interrogation. This isn't intimidation. This is me giving you one chance to do the right thing before I do what I came here to do. She paused and let that sink in. The women you've taken, they're someone's daughters, someone's sisters. They have families who are looking for them, friends who miss them, futures that you've stolen. I want them back. Kozlov stared at the knife, and Sarah could see him calculating odds and possibilities. He was trying to figure out if she was bluffing, trying to assess how far she was willing to go. It was the wrong calculation to be making. There's a warehouse, he said finally. South of the city, near the port. Industrial area, mostly abandoned at night. Volkov has it set up like a processing center. Girls come in, get cleaned up, documented, then shipped out to other cities. How many women are there right now? I don't know. Maybe a dozen, maybe more. It changes all the time. Kozlov was talking faster now, the words tumbling out as if he couldn't stop them. Look, I just recruit them. I don't handle the other stuff. I bring them in, I get paid, that's it. The address of the warehouse. Kozlov rattled off a street address in an industrial district that Sarah knew was mostly empty factories and shipping facilities. The kind of place where people could scream without anyone hearing, where trucks could come and go at all hours without attracting attention. Jessica reappeared from the bedroom, carrying a small suitcase, and looking like someone who couldn't quite believe what was happening. Sarah reached in her own pocket and pulled out a handful of 20s, money she'd been saving for groceries and rent, but this was more important. Take this, she told Jessica, holding out the money. Get a cab, go somewhere safe. Do you have family you can call? Jessica nodded, taking the money with shaking hands. My sister lives in Portland. I haven't talked to her in 2 years, but call her. Tonight. Tell her you need help, and don't worry about explaining everything right now. Sarah looked directly into the young woman's eyes. Whatever happened here tonight, whatever he did to you, that's over now. You're free to go, and nobody is going to come after you. After Jessica left, Sarah turned her attention back to Kozlov. His companion was still unconscious on the floor, breathing steadily, but showing no signs of waking up anytime soon. The apartment was quiet except for the movie still playing on the television. Now comes the hard part, Sarah said, sitting down in a chair facing the couch. You're going to call Dmitry Volkov and tell him that there's been a complication. Tell him that someone has compromised your operation and that he needs to shut down the warehouse immediately. He'll kill me if I do that. He'll think I'm working with the police. He'll kill you if you don't do it, and I have to pay him a visit personally. Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. Vincent, you need to understand something. I'm not going away. This isn't going to blow over. Either you help me shut this down cleanly, or shut it down my way, and my way tends to leave a lot more bodies. Kozlov stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see him trying to process the implications of what she was saying. Finally, he reached for his phone. What am I supposed to tell him about you? About what happened here? Tell him the truth. Tell him that someone is hunting your people, someone who knows how to find them and how to hurt them. Tell him that the smart play is to cut his losses and move his operation somewhere else, somewhere far away from here. Kozlov made the call, speaking in rapid Russian that Sarah couldn't understand but could interpret from his tone and body language. He was scared, trying to explain a situation that probably sounded impossible to whoever was on the other end of the line. The conversation went on for several minutes, with Kozlov's voice becoming increasingly desperate as he tried to convince his boss to take the threat seriously. When he finally hung up, Kozlov looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He wants to meet with you. Tomorrow night, neutral ground. He says if you're really as dangerous as you seem, maybe you can work something out. Sarah shook her head. No meetings, no negotiations, no deals. I want the women released and the operation shut down. If that happens, your people can leave town and find somewhere else to practice their trade. If it doesn't happen, I come for all of you. You don't understand, Kozlov said, desperation creeping into his voice. Volkov doesn't just run a trafficking operation. He's connected to people in Moscow, people who have resources you can't imagine. You can't fight them all. I don't have to fight them all, Sarah replied. I just have to fight enough of them that the rest decide it's not worth the trouble. She stood up, and walked toward the door. "You have 24 hours. After that, I start visiting your associates personally." As Sarah reached the door, she turned back to look at Kozlov one more time. He was sitting on the couch, staring at his unconscious companion, and probably trying to figure out how his night had gone so completely wrong. "Vincent," she said quietly, "the women in that warehouse, they're not merchandise. They're people with names and families and dreams. Whatever you've convinced yourself about what you do for a living, remember that." Sarah left the apartment and made her way back to the stairwell, moving quickly but quietly through the building. She had what she'd come for, the location of the warehouse, and confirmation that her instincts about the trafficking operation had been correct. But now came the hard part, figuring out how to free a dozen women from a facility that was probably heavily guarded and definitely under the control of people who had no intention of letting their investment walk away. As she emerged from the building into the cool night air, Sarah's mind was already working on the problem. She had 24 hours to plan and execute a rescue operation that would make her previous night's activities look like a warm-up exercise. It was the kind of mission she'd trained for her entire adult life, but she'd never attempted it alone, without backup, and without the resources of the United States military. But she'd given Kozlov her word, and Sarah Mitchell had never broken a promise to free innocent people from captivity. She wasn't about to start now, even if it meant taking on a Russian mob single-handed. The warehouse was about to receive a visitor, and Sarah intended to make sure it was a visit that Dmitry Volkov and his organization would never forget. The only question was whether she could get the women out safely before the shooting started. Because one way or another, there was definitely going to be shooting. Sarah spent the morning conducting reconnaissance of the warehouse district, using a rented car to drive through the industrial area while mapping out the terrain and identifying potential entry and exit points. The address Kozlov had given her led to a sprawling complex of converted shipping facilities and abandoned factories, exactly the kind of place where illegal activities could flourish without much risk of discovery. The warehouse itself was a two-story concrete structure surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Security cameras were mounted at regular intervals, and Sarah counted at least 4 guards patrolling the perimeter on foot. 2 black SUVs were parked near the main entrance, and she could see additional vehicles moving in and out of the complex at irregular intervals. From her position in a coffee shop across from the main gate, Sarah used a pair of binoculars to study the facility's operations. The guards were armed and alert, moving with the kind of professional precision that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. These weren't street criminals playing at being tough guys. They were serious operators working for a serious organization. At noon, a white van pulled up to the warehouse gates. Sarah watched as 2 men got out and opened the rear doors, revealing at least 6 young women who were clearly being moved against their will. The women were helped or forced out of the van and escorted into the building by armed guards. Fresh merchandise for Volkov's operation. Sarah's jaw tightened as she watched the transaction. These women were probably immigrants, runaways, or addicts who'd been promised legitimate work or help with their problems. Instead, they were being fed into a machine that would strip away their identities, their freedom, and eventually their lives. She'd seen human trafficking operations during her deployments overseas, and she knew how they worked. The women would be held in the warehouse for a few days while they were processed, photographed, documented, and broken down psychologically until resistance became impossible. Then, they'd be shipped to cities across the country, sold to brothels, private clients, or worse. The 24 hours she'd given Kozlov were almost up, and there was no sign that Volkov intended to shut down his operation voluntarily. Sarah had expected as much. Criminals like Volkov didn't build successful enterprises by backing down every time someone threatened them. But she'd had to give them the chance to do the right thing, even knowing they probably wouldn't take it. At 6 o'clock that evening, Sarah's burner phone rang. Jake Morrison's number appeared on the screen, which probably meant he'd found something she needed to know. "Please tell me you're not about to do what I think you're about to do," Jake said without preamble. "That depends on what you think I'm about to do," Sarah replied. "I think you're about to launch a one-woman assault on a heavily fortified criminal facility for the purpose of freeing kidnapped women. And I think you're going to get yourself killed in the process." Sarah smiled despite the seriousness of the situation. "When you put it like that, it does sound a little ambitious." "Sarah, I've been making some calls. Unofficial channels, people who owe me favors. The FBI has been building a case against Volkov for 3 years. They're close to moving, maybe another month or two before they have enough evidence to make arrests that will stick." "How many women will disappear in another month or two?" Sarah asked. "How many lives will be destroyed while the FBI builds their perfect case?" Jake sighed, the sound of a man who knew he was fighting a losing battle. "At least let me help. I could get you blueprints of the facility, intel on their security procedures, maybe even coordinate with some local law enforcement contacts. No, if this goes wrong, I don't want anyone else getting blamed for it. This is my operation, my responsibility. Sarah, Jake, I need you to do something for me. If I don't check in by tomorrow morning, I want you to call the police and tell them to check that warehouse. Tell them there are kidnapped women being held there, and make sure they understand it's urgent." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You're really going to do this, aren't you?" "I gave my word to those women, even if they don't know it yet." A Navy SEAL doesn't break her word. After ending the call, Sarah returned to her apartment and began her final preparations. She changed into black tactical clothing, cargo pants with multiple pockets for equipment, a long-sleeve shirt that would provide some protection against cuts and scrapes, and boots that were comfortable for running but quiet enough for stealth operations. Her weapon selection was limited by what she could carry and conceal. The knives she'd used for the past few nights, a small first aid kit, zip ties for restraining prisoners, and a tactical flashlight that could double as a club if necessary. She considered trying to acquire a firearm for the operation, but guns were loud and messy, and this mission required precision rather than firepower. At midnight, Sarah made her way back to the warehouse district. The area was even quieter at night, with only the occasional truck passing through on its way to the port facilities. Security lighting was sparse, creating pools of brightness separated by vast areas of shadow, perfect conditions for someone who knew how to use darkness as a weapon. Sarah approached the warehouse from the rear, with a fence bordered an empty lot filled with rusted shipping containers. The razor wire was a problem, but not an insurmountable one. She packed a pair of heavy work gloves and a small bolt cutter, tools that would allow her to create a hole in the fence without triggering any obvious alarms. It took her 15 minutes to cut through the chain link and peel back a section large enough to crawl through. The rear of the warehouse had fewer cameras and no foot patrols. Apparently, Volkov's security team had decided that the razor wire and the remote location were sufficient deterrents for anyone approaching from that direction. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Sarah made her way along the rear wall of the building, staying in the shadows while she looked for an entry point. Most of the windows were too small or too high to be practical, but she found what she was looking for near the loading dock, a service door that appeared to be used for maintenance access. The lock was more sophisticated than the one on Kozlov's apartment, but not by much. Sarah worked on it for nearly 5 minutes, conscious that every second increased the risk of discovery. Finally, she heard the soft click of the mechanism disengaging, and the door opened into a darkened corridor. Sarah slipped inside and closed the door behind her, then stood perfectly still for 30 seconds while her eyes adjusted to the darkness and her ears cataloged the sounds of the building. She could hear voices coming from somewhere ahead of her, men talking in low tones, probably guard stationed near the main entrance. Underneath the conversation, she could hear something else that made her blood boil, women's voices quiet and frightened, coming from the upper floor. She found a staircase at the end of the corridor and began climbing, testing each step carefully to avoid creaks that might alert the guards below. The stairs led to a hallway lined with what had probably been offices when the building was used for legitimate purposes. Now, based on the sounds coming from behind the doors, they'd been converted into holding cells. Sarah tried the first door and found it locked from the outside. Through the thin walls, she could hear movement and quiet conversation in what sounded like Spanish. She moved to the next door and found the same situation, locked from the outside, with voices indicating multiple occupants. Working quickly, Sarah used her lock picks to open the first door. Inside, She found 4 young women sitting on mattresses that had been thrown on the floor. They looked up at her with expressions of fear and confusion, clearly unsure whether she represented rescue or a new threat. "I'm here to help," Sarah said quietly in English, then repeated the phrase in the limited Spanish she'd picked up during deployments in South America. "Police are coming. We need to leave now." The women stared at her in disbelief. One of them, a girl who couldn't have been more than 19, started to cry. Another asked something in rapid Spanish that Sarah couldn't understand, but the tone was clear enough. They wanted to know if this was real, if they were actually being rescued. Sarah moved to the second room and found 3 more women, then to a third room with 2 others. In total, 9 women were being held on the upper floor, ranging in age from late teens to early 30s. Most appear to be Latina, but she also found 2 who seemed to be Eastern European and one who might have been Southeast Asian. Getting all 9 women out of the building safely was going to be a challenge. They were scared, confused, and some of them appeared to be under the influence of drugs that had been used to keep them compliant. Sarah needed to move quickly before the guards downstairs discovered that their prisoners had been liberated. "Listen to me," Sarah said to the group, speaking slowly and clearly. "My name is Sarah, and I'm going to get you out of here. We have to be very quiet, and we have to move quickly. Do you all understand?" Most of the women nodded, though some still looked like they couldn't quite believe what was happening. Sarah could understand their confusion. After days or weeks of captivity, the idea of rescue probably seemed impossible. Sarah led the group toward the staircase, signaling for them to stay close together and move as quietly as possible. She made it halfway down the stairs when her luck ran out. "Hey!" A voice shouted from the bottom of the staircase. "Who's up there?" Heavy footsteps were already pounding up the stairs. Sarah turned to the women behind her and whispered urgently, "Go back. Find somewhere to hide. I'll come get you." Then she turned to face whoever was coming up the stairs and prepare to do what Navy SEALs did best: adapt, improvise, and overcome whatever obstacles stood between her and mission success. The first guard to reach the top of the stairs was a large man with a shaved head and arms covered in prison tattoos.